nii, selge, suur tänu teile. Aitäh arhitektuurikeskusele, aitäh Sadamale selle ürituse korraldamise eest. Ma räägin inglise keeles, et meil oleks lihtsam aru saada ja vabandan nende ees, kellel on vaja tõlki kasutada. So I'm going to speak in English. Thank you for the organizers for the invitation to share the opinion of the Zaadid's master plan entry for the Port of Tallinn. I also shared a written opinion with some of you who have possibly seen it in the audience. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully this will be useful. So first, this competition called for a bold re-envisioning how a considerable amount of land in the Port of Tallinn could be repurposed for urban operations that are no longer needed for the port. So only areas 1 and 7 were meant to be kept for port operations. The rest offers an opportunity to redevelop the areas. And this competition also had a secondary goal, which was given the very central importance of the site right next to the waterfront, and given the sort of historic nature of the waterfront being cut off either through the Iron Curtain or now through some of the port operations from the city center, then it's of vital importance to connect the port area with the surrounding urban districts of Põhja-Tallinn, Vanalinn, Kesklinn, Kadriorg, and so on, and essentially contribute to opening the city center to the sea. So the Zaha team's master plan proposal, which you're all familiar with and which I've had an opportunity to study in great detail over the last week or two, proposes a number of important ideas. And I will start with some of the merits that I see as positives, and then I will also talk about some of the shortcomings that I see as problematic for Tallinn. First, I do think that the redevelopment of the two new terminals, whether they be shifted or not, would be very important. I think we currently have the two most important stations of arrival to Tallinn, which are completely under-celebrated, and they process somewhere between 5 to 10 million passengers per year together. And they're in combination together much more important than all the other stations combined, and they should form key urban activators. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity to activate the port area. Second, I think that the proposed park in the north of the site along the area that's behind terminals A and B to be converted into a publicly accessible park is also a very, very welcome idea that would significantly expand the waterfront contact zone for the general public, and be able to walk along that cruise area all the way to the back of the pier, which is so far blocked for public access, would really reshape how the general public would experience the waterfront district of Tallinn. Third, I think the scheme solves quite generously and very efficiently the logistic asks or logistic demands of the port. It proposes even a grade separated circulation, so where trucks and buses going to the boats can efficiently loop in and out of both terminals, on the one side through Reidi Road and on the other side through Sadama Street. And therefore, I think the scheme works quite well for the operations of the port. But I also have a series of important shortcomings that I would like to share with you after having studied the plan in detail. First of all, it proposes an entirely different urban form from the rest of the city center. And whereas some of the jury members have seem to see that as a benefit, I see that as a major shortcoming. I think that the fact that the Port of Tallinn and the Seaside district have so long been cut off from the city center, both physically but also mentally, means that the area instead requires a close integration and continuity from the other urban districts surrounding it. So from the Kadriorg side, Kesklinn side, Põhja-Tallinn side, and I think that the it's important to actually achieve a continuity in urban form with a similar pattern or similar rhythm of building entrances, encounters, land ownership patterns, street facades, and atmospheres to make it feel as part of the Tallinn city center rather than as a standalone separated district, which might resemble, for instance, Puerto Madero in Buenos Aires, which is also a waterfront district, but completely separated from the rest of the city center. I have had the chance to visit several of the Zahed's office projects internationally. One of their best-known master plans, which is in Singapore, in One North, produced an urban environment like this, with very large buildings, very little street activity, and relatively large traffic in between. I don't think that's the sort of aim that we should have for Tallinn, and I think we have to work really hard to make sure that the sort of density and vibrancy is produced as a result, rather than a series of standalone architectural symbols or projects. Second, the central organizing feature of the plan is this so-called stream. It's a pedestrian walkway that starts from Kadriorg and runs through parallel to Reidi Road and then diagonally across the Admiralty Basin and then towards Terminal A and then terminates somewhere behind the Linnahall. And that's a very strong feature of the project that is kind of the whole organizing principle. And I would actually argue or question whether that stream is running in the right direction. What I mean by that is that, again, in my view, the most important connections that Tallinn Center and the port needs are lateral, not longitudinal. And I would like, to question who is going to be using that stream. If it connects from the waterfront in Kadriorg in this way across the Admiralty Basin back to the terminals, then what day-to-day connection does it really serve? Is it the joggers and the runners who come from Kadriorg to the city center? Is that the sort of key audience for this? Or why does it not kind of focus instead on tying in with the adjacent neighborhoods in Põhja-Tallinn, Kesklinn, Vanalinn, and so on? Along the stream, there are certain areas that are designated as key public spaces, some of them elevated. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, you see a part where the pedestrian deck is elevated up to an upper level, and the Sadama Street traffic is supposed to pass underneath it in order to access the loading area of terminals A and B. I am also concerned that these areas are heavily under-programmed and would possibly face a future where we have empty public spaces similar to the current roof deck of Linnahall. Linnahall also is a generous public pedestrian deck with very little programming around it and very few kind of important destinations, so it stands empty most of the day. And I'm frankly quite concerned of a similar fate in some of those key public spaces that are envisioned in the project. Another example that comes to mind is perhaps the elevated walkway in Pudong in Shanghai, which also has a sort of a walkway, but doesn't necessarily have critical destinations along it, and Tallinn doesn't even compete at all with the densities that Shanghai would have to activate that. In the two key sections where the so-called stream is supposed to get elevated, this is the other part of it by Kadriorg side. This is the corner of Kadriorg where Reidi Road turns along the waterfront. It's envisioned that the road is practically sort of half tunneled underneath with sort of skylights above it. I think that in the context of Tallinn, there are several problems with such multi-layered or grade separated solutions. First, I already mentioned the activation problem, that if we separate the street and the pedestrians, then we are likely to kind of kill off both. They would both have a character that's kind of a very modernist sort of function separated area with too little happening together. Second, I think that there's also a grave danger of privatizing public space. I think that in the context of Tallinn, only the private developers would be able to deliver the second grade level decking construction. The city has absolutely no experience nor funding to do such things. And I think this could easily lead to a very private character of public space, which I think would be undesirable for the city. So this complex of buildings controlled and financed by the private sector, turning these key spaces into a private enclave. I think the character that might emerge of it is, I'm sure, familiar with it for the London team. For instance, the Barbican deck, which is again a private public space on top of the building. It has certain programs every once in a while, but by and large, it doesn't really contribute to the sort of activation of the area in London. It's an introverted type of space, and I'm concerned of the character that it might produce in the elevated parts of the stream in Tallinn. Now, one of the most important points, I am personally very concerned by the scale of the buildings being proposed. If you look into the details, if you put a tape measure to the master plan close up, you will see that a lot of the buildings are massive for Tallinn's scale. Just visually compare the north and south side of Reidi Road here. I mean, I know the south side is partly photo collage, but it represents the scale of construction or scale of buildings that are common in the Tallinn city center. And the scale of buildings proposed in the north are just several times larger and, in my view, excessive, and would contribute to kind of a corporate and dull character of the area. Just for comparison, this building here is 135 meters long. Think of an example in Tallinn. This is the Hotel Tallink, the old teenindusmaja in the city center next to Viru. This is 100 meters long. So we're talking even larger scale than that for single buildings. And my real concern is that these sorts of buildings in Tallinn tend to generate a single entrance, at best a couple of entrances with one side entirely dedicated to service activities and garages, and really not contribute to an active and interesting street environment. Instead, I think we would very much like to see a lot more party wall construction, a lot smaller building volumes with more diverse ownership patterns. One metric that I think would be useful for the city to consider just for evaluating the impact that such scale could have on the day-to-day experience of the neighborhood is to measure how many address points you can walk to in a 300-meter walkshed or something like a 4 or 5 minute walkshed. How many different addresses can you reach on foot? And I've done the quick evaluation here. If you look into the old town of Tallinn, within that 300-meter walkshed, you reach about 35 to 45 different address points. If you look around the Kesklinn or the CBD district, it's quite similar in most cases. And if you look into the proposed master plan as it is now, it radically drops. It's something, in occasions, it's around 5 address points within 300 meters, and sometimes it goes up to 20, but it's still a very significant difference. And this contributes to this sort of cognitive experience of the place. In my view, also cuts up the sort of continuity of the density of the city center as we walk to the port. And I would very much urge the city to consider a much denser building pattern than these volumes that are being proposed right now. Next, I was also personally surprised and also concerned by the traffic modeling that the team presented. If you look into the numbers on the left-hand side, this is the evening peak hour vehicle traffic estimates, and on the right-hand side, it's the evening peak hour pedestrian and bike traffic estimates. Then the traffic estimates for vehicles are consistently around 10 times higher than for pedestrians and bicycles. And I think we all need to take it as our responsibility to make sure that such a grand development in the port of Tallinn would reverse the trend, would rather have 10 times more pedestrians than 10 times more vehicles on the site. And I think it's problematic that the proposal envisions a very car-heavy future for this site. And I know that some of this has to do with the operations of the port, but even there's discussions of decentralizing the truck operations. And as urban designers, I think it's our responsibility to restructure that nature, to restructure that future, and make sure that we create a heavily pedestrian and public transit-oriented waterfront rather than a car-heavy waterfront. And lastly, I'd like to talk about program. I was personally also concerned about the very high-end luxury proposal around the program. The program, by and large, is office space. So all of the blue buildings here are office space. And the only residential component that's significant, which is towards the Kadriorg side, is on this reclamation area. So it's actually a large question mark whether that could ever be done, given the sort of environmental interests in Tallinn and the protection of the waterfront, whether such an extension to the sea would ever happen, which would possibly risk a residential component altogether. But even if we follow the descriptions of what's being proposed, for instance, the orange buildings on the top in the northern part are designated as hotels or service apartments. These are all, in the context of Tallinn, super high-end luxury programs. And I'm very concerned that the proposal doesn't integrate enough for common citizens of Tallinn. It feels like another luxury waterfront district with very expensive apartments with yachts and marinas and spas, etc. Even the team in their description provides the following quotes, referring to Tallinners, saying that the locals will be attracted through the waterfront promenade to the marina and the wellness spa gardens, which will be used in summer as well as winter. I just want to put it on the table and ask how many Tallinners go to spas and marinas. And I think it's very important that the port is not a privatist developers. After all, the Port of Tallinn is a public authority owned by the state of Estonia and represents the public interests of the state of Estonia and Tallinners. And I think programming is critical to make sure that this site also contains affordable housing, which is a looming crisis in Tallinn, housing for regular people in Tallinn, commercial programs that come along with the residents if they're sort of more moderate budget residents in the area, and not focus on the sort of luxury developments and service departments and grade A office space only. I think if we do so, we end up with a separated elitist district in the waterfront that most of us in Tallinn have no reason to go to. So just to conclude, in my assessment, the proposal well addresses the interests of the port, the logistics of the port, and also of the tourists, creating a sort of very tourist kind of friendly showcase neighborhood for Tallinn. But I think it does fail to address the common interests of typical Tallinners. And I think it would be a pity to create a separated and heavily privatized elitist waterfront. I think that would not serve the interest of the city. I also think that the challenge in the 21st century is not to create another separated and disconnected sort of grand experiment in the Tallinn city center, but to more humbly try to weave the waterfront neighborhoods and waterfront districts in with the rest of the city center, to Kalamaja, Kadriorg, Old Town, Kesklinn, etc., using continuous streets. And if you notice, one of the missing documents or something that's really hard to read out of the project is the question of the street pattern, the street network, because the project focuses entirely on this pedestrian stream, and the typical street pattern is in fact largely missing. There are very, very few roads, if at all, where one could sort of walk or drive along the normal street into the port area and pass through. Most of the roads lead to private garages or to the port facilities and parking lots, and it doesn't create a street network that blends in with the rest of the city center, which in my view is problematic. And I think lastly, it's very important when we talk about master planning to imagine what it would look like if every single building, if every single of those white volumes were done by a very modest or average local architect, which is very likely the kind of the real world scenario that would happen if we were to proceed with this. Why would the buildings need to be so large? Why would they need to be so far apart? And why wouldn't they create continuous street frontages from the rest of the city center? And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you very much for those very constructive remarks.